Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. Welcome to my channel Midnight Stories, where you find horror stories that scare you. Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. October 12th, 1999. My name is Jeremiah Holt. I'm a divorced mechanic with no kids, living in a small town near the Ozark Mountains. I've always been a bit of a loner, finding solace in the quiet of nature rather than the bustle of town life. That's why I bought that little cabin up in the woods a few years back. It was nothing fancy, just a simple one-room structure with a small kitchen area, a fireplace, and a cramped bathroom. But it was mine, and it was my escape. I remember the day everything changed like it was yesterday. It was October 12th, 1999, the start of deer season. Though I owned a hunting rifle, I wasn't much of a hunter myself. For me, the season was more an excuse to retreat to my cabin, enjoy the crisp autumn air, and maybe have a few beers by the campfire. The drive up to the cabin that day was uneventful. The narrow, winding road snaked through the mountains, fiery fall colors painting the landscape in shades of red, orange, and gold. As I pulled up to the cabin, I felt the familiar sense of peace wash over me. The woods were old here, ancient really. They had a presence about them, a weight of history and secrets that both calmed and intrigued me. I spent the first few days doing what I always did, hiking the nearby trails, chopping firewood, and fixing up little things around the cabin. There was always something that needed attention. This time it was a leaky spot in the roof that I patched up. The work felt good, honest. It was a far cry from the complex engines and stubborn customers I dealt with back in town. Evenings were my favorite. I'd sit on the small porch nursing a cold beer, watching the sunset behind the trees. The forest would come alive with night sounds, owls hooting, crickets chirping, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It was during one of these quiet evenings that I first noticed something was off. It started with a feeling, really. A prickling on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild in the isolation. But then I heard it. Footsteps, heavy ones, circling the cabin. At first I figured it must be some drunk hunter who'd gotten turned around in the dark. It wouldn't be the first time someone had stumbled upon my little slice of paradise by accident. I called out, "Hey there, you lost?" My voice echoed in the darkness, but there was no response. Just an eerie silence that seemed to swallow up even the usual nighttime sounds. I waited, straining my ears for any noise, but there was nothing. Eventually I convinced myself it was probably just a deer or maybe a black bear, common enough in these parts. I went to bed, but sleep didn't come easy that night. The next morning I woke early, the events of the previous night still nagging at me. I decided to take a look around the cabin just to ease my mind. That's when I saw them. Tracks in the soft earth around the cabin. They were like nothing I'd ever seen before, and I'd seen plenty of animal tracks in my time. These were big, much larger than a bear's, with long curved claw marks at the end of each toe. The stride length was immense, suggesting whatever made them was tall, really tall. As I followed the tracks, I noticed something else. Tufts of fur snagged on a low-hanging branch near one of the windows. It was coarse and dark, unlike any animal fur I recognized. My gut churned with a mix of fear and curiosity. Something wasn't right here, but I couldn't put my finger on what exactly was wrong. As a precaution, I went inside and loaded my hunting rifle. Better safe than sorry, I thought. That night things escalated. The noises returned, but this time they were unmistakable. Something was out there, something big. I could hear it moving around the cabin, its heavy footfalls crunching on the fallen leaves. Then came the scratching, the horrific sound of claws dragging across the wooden walls of the cabin. I sat rigid in my chair by the fireplace, rifle clutched in my sweaty hands. The scratching moved from wall to wall, circling the cabin. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, Not quite. Well, I didn't know what. Gathering my courage, I moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The fire cast flickering shadows across the yard, and in those dancing shadows I saw it. A hulking silhouette far too tall to be natural, its head cocked at an odd angle, as if it were studying the cabin. Studying me. My heart pounded in my chest so hard I was sure the creature could hear it. I'm not a man who scares easily. I've faced down angry customers and even a few barroom brawls in my day. But this was something else entirely. Every instinct in my body screamed danger. I decided I needed to do something, to chase it off somehow. With shaking hands, I moved to the door, planning to fire a warning shot over its head. But the moment I cracked open the door, I froze. There it was, crouched on my porch, not 10 feet away from me. In that moment, bathed in the warm glow of the firelight spilling from the open door, I got my first real look at the creature. Even now, years later, I struggle to describe it accurately. It's as if my mind rebels against the memory, trying to protect me from the sheer otherworldliness of what I saw. It was massive, easily as tall as me even in its crouched position, and I stand over 6 feet. Its body was lean but corded with rippling muscles visible beneath a hide of taut, leathery skin. The arms were too long for its body, ending in hands tipped with claws that looked sharp enough to gut a deer in one swipe. Those claws dripped with some dark, viscous fluid that I prayed wasn't blood. But it was the creature's head that truly horrified me. It had a long, wolfish snout filled with row upon row of jagged teeth, each one looking sharp enough to tear through bone. Its nose was split, reminiscent of a snake's, flaring as it sniffed the air. And the eyes, God, those eyes. They were a sickly yellow color, glowing with an unnatural light and filled with an intelligence that chilled me to my core. This wasn't just some animal. There was a calculating, predatory mind behind those eyes. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. I was paralyzed with fear, my finger frozen on the trigger of my rifle. The creature studied me, its head tilting this way and that like a curious dog. Then it let out a hiss, a sound so alien and terrifying that it broke me from my trance. I slammed the door shut, my hand shaking so badly I could barely throw the lock. Cursing myself for not taking the shot when I had the chance, I quickly moved to barricade the door with whatever furniture I could drag over. All the while I could hear the creature outside, circling the cabin, those heavy footsteps punctuated by occasional scratches against the walls and windows. Sleep was out of the question. I spent the night huddled in a corner, rifle aimed at the door, jumping at every sound. Those glowing eyes peered in through the windows periodically, watching, waiting. I've never felt so hunted, so utterly vulnerable in all my life. When the first rays of sunlight finally began to filter through the windows, the noises outside ceased. I waited for what felt like hours, ears straining for any sound of the creature's presence. Finally, when the sun was well and truly up, I gathered the courage to look outside. The area around the cabin looked like a war zone. Deep furrows were carved into the earth, trees bore deep scratch marks, and in several places I found more of that coarse, dark fur. But what caught my attention were the tracks, the same enormous clawed footprints I'd seen the day before. They led away from the cabin, deeper into the woods. I knew I should leave, pack up my things and get the hell out of there. But something held me back. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe I just couldn't believe what had happened and needed some kind of proof. Whatever the reason, I found myself following those tracks into the forest. The trail led me deeper into the woods than I'd ever ventured before. The trees grew denser, older, their gnarled branches blocking out much of the sunlight. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the forest itself was trying to warn me away. Still I pressed on, following those massive footprints. After about an hour of hiking, I came upon a small clearing. There, half hidden by thick underbrush, was the mouth of a cave. The tracks led directly to it, disappearing into the inky blackness beyond. The entrance was larger than I expected, easily big enough for something as large as the creature I'd seen to pass through comfortably. I'm not sure what I expected to find, but standing there, staring into that yawning darkness, I felt a deep sense of wrongness. This place didn't feel natural. The air around the cave entrance was noticeably cooler, and there was a faint, acrid smell that made my nose wrinkle. I wasn't completely reckless. I knew better than to venture into an unknown cave, especially one that might house the creature I'd encountered. So I kept my distance, observing from the edge of the clearing. That's when I saw something that turned my blood to ice. Just outside the cave entrance, partially hidden by some low bushes, was a pile of bones. At first glance, I thought they might be deer bones, not uncommon in these woods. But as I looked closer, I realized with growing horror that not all of them were animal bones. Some were unmistakably human. My mind reeled trying to process what I was seeing. How long had this thing been out here? How many people had fallen victim to it? And why hadn't anyone noticed? As these questions swirled in my head, a movement at the cave entrance caught my eye. Something was emerging from the darkness. Time seemed to slow as the creature stepped into the dim light of the clearing. It was even more terrifying in broad daylight, its true form no longer hidden by shadows. But what it was dragging behind it, that's the image that still haunts my nightmares. It was the body of a man, or what was left of him. He was dressed in hunter's orange, his clothes torn and soaked with blood. One of his legs was missing entirely, and his face. I try not to remember his face. I stood there frozen in horror as the creature dropped its grisly prize near the pile of bones. It then turned, those yellow eyes locking onto me with terrifying intelligence. In that moment, I knew it had been aware of my presence the entire time. It had led me here deliberately, wanting me to see this. My paralysis broke, and I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. All I knew was that I had to get away. I didn't stop until I reached my cabin, my lungs burning and legs shaking from exertion. As I burst into the clearing around my cabin, I chanced to look back. There at the edge of the trees stood the creature. It wasn't chasing me. It just stood there, watching, those yellow eyes boring into me. Somehow that was even more terrifying than if it had pursued me. I packed my things in a frenzy, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip my duffel bag. I didn't start to calm down until I was miles down the mountain road, the familiar sights of civilization coming into view. My first stop was the sheriff's office. I knew I couldn't tell them everything. They'd think I was crazy. So I spun a tale about a rogue bear, aggressive and unnaturally large. I mentioned the hunter's body, describing it as a mauling. I could tell they didn't fully believe me, but they took my statement seriously enough to send a search party up to the area. They never found anything, of course. No bodies, no abnormally large animal tracks, nothing. They chalked it up to poachers operating out of season, and possibly me being a bit jumpy alone in the woods. They told me to let them know if I saw anything suspicious again. I sold that cabin as quickly as I could, practically giving it away. I couldn't stand the thought of owning it anymore, of anyone else staying there unaware of what lurked in those woods. I've never gone back to those mountains, and I never will. It's been years since that October night, but the memory of what I saw never fades. Some nights I wake in a cold sweat, certain I can see those yellow eyes watching me from the dark corners of my room. I've moved to a different town, tried to start over, but the fear lingers. Sometimes when I'm driving late at night and pass a particularly dense patch of woods, I can't help but wonder, is it out there? Has it spread beyond those Ozark forests? Is it hunting even now, adding to that gruesome pile of bones in its cave? I don't know if what I encountered was some undiscovered animal, a creature from Native American legend come to life, or something even more inexplicable. All I know is that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows of what we think we know. And once you've seen them, truly seen them, you can never unsee them. So I leave you with this warning. Be careful in the deep woods. Respect the old forests and the secrets they keep. And if you're ever alone in the wilderness and feel that prickling sensation of being watched, trust your instincts. Run, run, and don't look back, because sometimes the monsters are real. October 12th, 1999. That's when it all began. The day that changed everything I thought I knew about the world. My name is Finn Barlow, and I'm a carpenter by trade. I've always been good with my hands, able to see the potential in a piece of wood that others might overlook. It's a skill that served me well over the years, allowing me to build a decent life for myself. But on that crisp autumn day, as I drove my battered pickup truck along winding mountain roads, I had no idea that I was heading towards something that would shatter my understanding of reality. The job seemed straightforward enough. An old house tucked away in the White Mountains of New Hampshire needed extensive renovation work before winter set in. The pay was good, better than usual for this kind of gig, which should have been my first warning sign. But I was too focused on the opportunity to question it. The chance to work in solitude, surrounded by nature, was appealing. I've always been more comfortable with the quiet company of tools and timber than with the chaos of city life. As I navigated the narrow, twisting roads that led deeper into the mountains, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease creeping over me. The forests here were old, the trees towering sentinels that seemed to watch my progress with ancient, knowing eyes. Shadows deepened quickly as the sun dipped behind the peaks, and I found myself unconsciously pressing the accelerator, eager to reach my destination before full dark. The locals I'd encountered in the last town before the wilderness took over had been odd. Friendly enough on the surface, but there was a wariness in their eyes when I mentioned where I was headed. One old-timer at the general store, his face weathered like old leather, had fixed me with a hard stare. "You be careful up there, son," he'd said, his voice low and gravelly. "Folks have been known to vanish in those parts. Been happening for centuries, some say." I'd laughed it off at the time, chalking it up to small-town superstition. But now, as the shadows lengthened and the forest pressed in around me, those words took on a more ominous tone. Finally, after what felt like hours of driving, I spotted the turnoff. A barely visible dirt road, more of a trail really, snaking off into the gloom. My headlights caught the reflective surface of a battered mailbox, the numbers matching those I'd been given. This was it. The house, when I finally laid eyes on it, was a sorry sight. 2 stories of weathered clapboard siding, windows dark and lifeless, a sagging porch that looked ready to collapse at any moment. It hunched there in a small clearing, as if trying to shrink away from the encroaching forest. But to my carpenter's eye, I could see the bones of something beautiful beneath the neglect. With some hard work and skill, this place could be transformed. I parked my truck and climbed out, stretching muscles stiff from the long drive. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and decaying leaves. As I breathed deeply, savoring the clean mountain air, a twig snapped somewhere in the surrounding woods. I whipped my head around, suddenly alert, but saw nothing but deepening shadows among the trees. Shaking off the momentary unease, I set about unloading my gear. Tools, supplies, enough food to last me a couple of weeks at least. The owner had assured me the place had running water and a generator for electricity, but I'd learned long ago to be prepared for anything on remote jobs like this. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often I'd pause, certain I'd caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, but each time I looked directly, there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows growing darker by the minute. "Get a grip, Finn," I muttered to myself, hefting my toolbox. "You're letting those old stories get to you." But even as I climbed the creaking steps and unlocked the front door, I couldn't quite convince myself that everything was as it should be. Something about this place, about these mountains, felt wrong. Off-kilter in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. If I'd known then what I know now, I would have turned around, gotten back in my truck, and driven until this god-forsaken place was nothing but a speck in my rearview mirror. But I didn't know. So I stepped across the threshold into the musty darkness of the old house, and unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that would change my life forever. The interior of the house was a time capsule, layers of history visible in the peeling wallpaper and worn floorboards. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight as I made my way through the rooms, taking stock of the work ahead. It was extensive, but nothing I couldn't handle, or so I thought. I spent that first night on a camping cot in what would eventually become the living room, surrounded by my tools and the creaking sounds of the old house settling. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by strange dreams of moving shadows and glowing eyes watching me from the darkness. Morning brought a semblance of normalcy. Sunlight streamed through the grimy windows, transforming the house from a den of shadows into a more benign if dilapidated structure. I set to work with enthusiasm, tearing out rotted boards and shoring up weak spots in the foundation. The days began to blur together, each one a rhythm of physical labor that left me exhausted but satisfied. I made good progress, and for a while I managed to convince myself that my unease that first night had been nothing more than the product of an overactive imagination. But as the first week drew to a close, things began to change. It started small, almost imperceptible. Tools that weren't quite where I'd left them, the sensation of eyes on the back of my neck when I worked outside. And the dreams, they grew more vivid, more terrifying. I'd wake in a cold sweat, the echo of an inhuman howl ringing in my ears. Then came the morning I found the tracks. I'd stepped outside at dawn, stretching in the cool mountain air, when something caught my eye. There, in a patch of soft earth near the tree line, was a series of prints unlike anything I'd ever seen. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own foot, with 5 long toes ending in deep claw marks. The shape was almost human, but distorted, wrong in a way that sent a chill down my spine. I tried to rationalize it. Some local playing a prank on the new guy, maybe. Or a bear, though I knew deep down that no bear made tracks like these. As I stood there staring at those impossible prints, the feeling of being watched intensified. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the overwhelming urge to run, to get in my truck and never look back. But I didn't. Whether it was stubbornness, curiosity, or simply the need for the paycheck, I stayed. And in doing so, I set myself on a collision course with something ancient and terrifying. Something that would shatter my understanding of the world and leave me forever changed. Little did I know, my real ordeal was just beginning. The days that followed the discovery of those tracks were filled with a growing sense of dread. I tried to focus on my work, pushing myself harder than ever in an attempt to finish the job quickly and get out of there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. It was about a week after I'd found the tracks that things came to a head. I'd been working late into the evening, trying to finish up some repairs in the kitchen. The rhythmic sound of my hammer striking nails had become almost meditative, allowing me to momentarily forget my fears. Then I heard it, a heavy thud against the side of the house, like something large had collided with the outer wall. The hammer slipped from my suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor. For a long moment I stood frozen, straining my ears for any further sound. Silence. With trembling hands, I reached for the flashlight I kept nearby. Part of me wanted to barricade myself inside, to hide until dawn and then flee this godforsaken place. But a larger part, driven by a mix of curiosity and stubborn pride, propelled me towards the door. The night air was crisp and still as I stepped onto the porch. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, dancing over the overgrown yard and the looming wall of trees beyond. At first I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then a movement caught my eye. There, at the edge of the woods, about 20 feet from where I stood, was a form that defied explanation. It was crouched low, a massive, twisted shape that my mind struggled to comprehend. As my light fell upon it, the creature seemed to flinch, shrinking back from the beam. My heart was hammering so loudly in my chest that I was sure the thing could hear it. Slowly, with a fluid grace that belied its size, the creature rose to its full height. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, possibly more. Its body was covered in coarse gray fur, all lean muscle and sinew. But it was the eyes that truly chilled me to my core. They were huge, reflecting my flashlight beam with an eerie amber glow. But it wasn't just the size or the color that was unsettling. There was an intelligence in those eyes, a cold, calculating awareness that spoke of something far more than a simple animal. And behind that intelligence I sensed something else, malice, hunger. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we stood there, locked in a silent standoff. Then with a speed that seemed impossible for its size, the creature moved. It let out a blood-curdling howl that shook me to my very soul, a sound that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone, vanishing into the darkness of the forest. I stumbled back inside, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. With shaking hands, I barricaded the door, piling furniture against it in a desperate bid for some sense of security. Sleep was out of the question. I spent the night huddled in a corner, my back to the wall, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. When morning finally came, I half expected to find that it had all been some vivid nightmare brought on by isolation and an overactive imagination. But the furniture was still piled against the door, and outside I found more tracks, deeper this time, as if the creature had been pacing around the house all night. But it was the other discovery that finally broke me. Near the edge of the woods I found the remains of a deer, or rather half of a deer. The carcass had been torn apart with brutal force, and the stench of death hung heavy in the air. That was it. I couldn't stay here any longer. Whatever was out there, whatever I'd seen, it was real, and it was dangerous. I threw my things haphazardly into my truck, not even bothering to pack properly. As I pulled away from the house, I couldn't help but glance in my rearview mirror. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw something large and dark move between the trees, watching me leave. I didn't look back again. The drive back to civilization was a blur. I pushed my old truck to its limits, half expecting at any moment to see that twisted form loping after me on the road. It wasn't until I was back in town, surrounded by the comforting sounds of normal, everyday life, that I began to relax. But the relaxation was short-lived. As the immediate fear faded, questions began to crowd my mind. What had I seen? What was that thing? And most pressingly, what should I do about it? I wrestled with the idea of going to the authorities. But what would I say? That I'd seen some kind of monster in the woods? They'd think I was crazy, or worse, that I was trying to cover up some kind of crime. No, going to the police wasn't an option. For weeks I tried to put it behind me. I took on small jobs around town, threw myself into mundane tasks, anything to keep my mind occupied. But I couldn't shake the memory of those glowing eyes, that inhuman howl. It was about a month after my experience in the mountains that I found myself in a bar on the outskirts of town. I wasn't much of a drinker usually, but that night I was seeking the numbing embrace of alcohol to quiet my thoughts. As I nursed my beer, my attention was caught by a conversation at a nearby table. Two men were discussing a recent news story. My blood ran cold as I listened. Another one gone missing up in the Whites, one man was saying, shaking his head sadly. Third one this year. Damn shame, his companion replied. They're saying it was near that old Carlson place, you know, the one that's been abandoned for years. I felt the color drain from my face. The Carlson place. That was the house I'd been working on. With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone and searched for local news. Sure enough, there it was. The hiker had gone missing in the White Mountains, last seen in an area uncomfortably close to where I'd been working. The article mentioned that search teams had found some unidentified animal tracks in the area. I knew what had made those tracks. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I'd known something was out there, something dangerous, and I'd run away. How many people had disappeared since then? How many lives had been lost because I'd been too scared to speak up? The guilt was overwhelming. I should have done something, said something, but even as I thought it, I knew that no one would have believed me. They'd have dismissed me as a drunk or a madman, just like I would have before I'd seen it with my own eyes. As I sat there wrestling with my conscience, my phone buzzed. A text message from a number I didn't recognize. The contents made my heart skip a beat. Finn, it's Egan. We need to talk about the Carlson job. Call me. Egan. My old boss. The one who'd set me up to that house in the first place. With shaking fingers I dialed the number. Egan's gruff voice answered on the second ring. Finn, he said, his tone grave. I think you and I need to have a conversation about what really happened up there. The meeting with Egan was set for the next day, at a quiet diner on the edge of town. I arrived early, my nerves jangling, half expecting Egan to show up with the police in tow. But when he walked in, he was alone, looking older and more haggard than I remembered. We ordered coffee, more for something to do with our hands than out of any real desire for caffeine. For a long moment we sat in silence, each waiting for the other to speak first. Finally, Egan sighed heavily. I owe you an apology, Finn, he said, his voice low. I should have warned you before I sent you up there, but I figured... Hell, I don't know what I figured. that maybe it was all just stories, old wives' tales. I felt a surge of anger. "You knew," I said, my voice tight. "You knew there was something up there, and you set me in blind." Egan nodded, his eyes downcast. "I knew the stories. Been hearing them all my life, but stories are just stories, right? At least that's what I told myself. Needed that job done, and you're the best I've got. Damn near got you killed." I wanted to be furious with him, but the guilt in his eyes was genuine. And if I was honest with myself, I probably wouldn't have believed him if he'd told me the truth beforehand. "What is it?" I asked, leaning in close. "That thing I saw. What the hell was it?" Egan glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers before answering. "The old-timers have a name for them. Skinwalkers, they call them. Not quite human, not quite animal. Something in between. Been here longer than us, they say, and they're hungry, always hungry." I felt a chill run down my spine at his words. Why doesn't anyone do anything? People are dying up there. Egan shook his head sadly. "You think no one's tried? Over the years there have been hunting parties, expeditions. They all end the same way. Either the hunters come back empty-handed, or they don't come back at all." We lapsed into silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on me. There was something out there, something dangerous, and it seemed like there was nothing we could do about it. But as I sat there staring into my cooling coffee, a resolve began to form in my mind. I couldn't just walk away from this, not again. I'd run once and people had died. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least try to do something. "I'm going back," I said, the words surprising me even as they left my mouth. Egan's head snapped up, his eyes wide with alarm. "Are you out of your mind? Didn't you hear a word I said? It's suicide." "Maybe," I admitted, "but I can't just sit here and do nothing. Not when I know what's out there, not when people are dying." For a long moment Egan stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he nodded. "You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the craziest," he said. "But if you're set on this, well, I reckon I owe you. I'm coming with you." I started to protest, but he held up a hand to silence me. "I sent you up there once without knowing the full story. I'm not making that mistake again. Besides," he added with a grim smile, "two pairs of eyes are better than one when you're hunting monsters." And so, with a mixture of determination and fear, we began to plan our return to the White Mountains. Little did we know we were about to embark on a journey that would test us to our very limits and force us to confront horrors beyond our wildest nightmares. The drive back up to the mountains was tense, to say the least. Egan and I had spent the past week preparing, gathering supplies and weapons. We had hunting rifles, silver bullets, at Egan's insistence. Apparently silver was supposed to be effective against skinwalkers, and enough provisions to last us a couple of weeks. As we wound our way up the familiar mountain roads, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread settling over me. The forest seemed darker, more menacing than I remembered. Every shadow held the potential for danger. Every rustle in the undergrowth set my heart racing. We arrived at the old Carlson place just as the sun was beginning to set. The house looked even more dilapidated than when I'd left it, as if the very land was trying to reclaim it. We set up camp in what had once been the living room, boarding up the windows and setting up a series of alarms around the perimeter. That first night was the hardest. Every creak of the old house, every whisper of wind through the trees had us on edge. We took turns keeping watch, our rifles close at hand. But nothing came. Days passed, blending into one another. We patrolled the area during the day, looking for signs of the creatures. At night we huddled in the house waiting, watching. The tension was unbearable. It was on the fifth night that everything changed. I was on watch, Egan sleeping fitfully nearby when I heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. I nudged Egan awake, pressing a finger to my lips for silence. We moved to the windows, peering out into the darkness. At first I saw nothing. Then a movement caught my eye. Something large was moving at the edge of the clearing, its form indistinct in the gloom. Egan must have seen it too, because I felt him tense beside me. Slowly, carefully, we raised our rifles. The creature moved again, and this time I caught a glimpse of glowing amber eyes. My heart leaped into my throat. It was the same creature I'd seen before. What happened next was a blur of chaos and terror. The creature charged, moving with impossible speed. We opened fire, the sound of gunshots shattering the night. I saw the creature stumble, heard it roar in pain and fury, but it kept coming. It crashed through the boarded-up window in a shower of glass and splintered wood. I caught a glimpse of matted fur, of razor-sharp claws, of those terrifying eyes blazing with hunger and rage. Egan and I fell back, still firing. The creature's movements became erratic, jerky. Our bullets were having an effect, but it wasn't going down. In desperation, I grabbed for the silver knife we'd brought as a last resort. The creature lunged at Egan, its massive form bowling him over. I saw claws flash, heard Egan scream of pain. Without thinking, I threw myself at the beast, driving the silver knife deep into its side. The effect was instantaneous. The creature let out a howl of agony, a sound so piercing it felt like it might shatter my eardrums. It thrashed wildly, throwing me off. I hit the wall hard, my vision blurring. Through the haze, I saw the creature stagger, black ichor oozing from its wounds. It fixed me with one last hate-filled glare, then turned and crashed back out through the broken window, disappearing into the night. For a long moment, all I could hear was my own ragged breathing and Egan's pained groans. We were alive, but barely. Egan's arm was badly mauled, and I was pretty sure I had a concussion. As the adrenaline began to fade, the full weight of what had just happened hit me. We'd faced the creature, wounded it, but we hadn't killed it. And now it knew we were here, knew we were a threat. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The aftermath of our encounter was a haze of pain and fear. I patched up Egan as best I could, using our limited first aid supplies. His arm was a mess of deep gashes, but the bleeding had slowed. We were both in bad shape, but alive, for now. As dawn broke, casting long shadows across the ruined living room, we took stock of our situation. Our supplies were scattered, many of our defenses destroyed. We were injured, exhausted, and now we knew for certain the creature was out there, and it was far more dangerous than we'd imagined. "We need help," Egan grunted, wincing as he tried to move his injured arm. "We can't do this alone." I nodded grimly. He was right, of course, but who could we possibly turn to? The authorities wouldn't believe us, and even if they did, they weren't equipped to handle something like this. That's when we heard it, a soft whistle from outside. Egan and I exchanged alarmed glances. Had the creature returned? But no, this sound was distinctly human. Cautiously, rifle at the ready, I approached the shattered window. What I saw made me blink in disbelief. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was a man. Tall, lean, with the weathered features of someone who'd spent a lifetime in these mountains. He was dressed in what looked like a mix of modern outdoor gear and traditional Native American clothing. And he was armed. I could see the gleam of a high-powered rifle slung across his back. The stranger raised his hand slowly, showing he meant no harm. "Looks like you boys could use a hand," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. Egan and I exchanged glances. After a moment's hesitation, I called back, "Who are you?" "Name's Nathaniel," the man replied. "I've been tracking that skinwalker you tangled with. Heard the commotion last night, figured I'd check it out." My mind raced. This man knew about the skinwalkers. He'd been tracking the creature. Could he be an ally? Cautiously, we invited Nathaniel inside. As he stepped through the ruined doorway, I couldn't help but notice the way his eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. This was a man who knew how to survive in dangerous situations. "You're lucky to be alive," Nathaniel said, examining our wounds with a practiced eye. "Not many folks survive a direct encounter with a skinwalker." As he helped us properly dress our injuries, Nathaniel explained his story. He was a member of a local Native American tribe, one that had been dealing with the skinwalker threat for generations. They were the protectors, he said, keeping the ancient evil at bay and preventing it from preying on unsuspecting outsiders. "But in recent years it's gotten harder," Nathaniel admitted, his face grim. "More people coming into the mountains, more potential victims, and the skinwalkers, they're getting bolder." We spent the rest of the day exchanging information. Nathaniel was a wealth of knowledge about the skinwalkers, their habits, their weaknesses, the best ways to fight them. Silver was indeed effective, as were certain herbs and rituals passed down through his tribe. As night fell, we prepared for another potential attack. But Nathaniel assured us that the skinwalker we'd wounded would be licking its wounds, at least for tonight. But it'll be back, he warned, and it won't be alone. These things, they hold grudges, and they're smart, far smarter than any normal animal. Over the next few days, Nathaniel taught us everything he could. We learned to move silently through the forest, to spot the subtle signs of skinwalker activity. We practiced with the weapons Nathaniel had brought, not just guns and knives, but also more esoteric tools. Pouches of sacred herbs that burned the creature's flesh, amulets that could disrupt their shape-shifting abilities. All the while, we could feel the tension building. The forest around us seemed to grow quieter, as if holding its breath. The skinwalkers were out there, watching, waiting for their moment to strike. It came on the 5th night after Nathaniel's arrival. We were gathered around a small fire, going over our plans one last time, when we heard it. A chorus of howls echoing through the mountains, but these weren't the howls of wolves. They were deeper, more guttural, with an almost human quality that sent chills down my spine. "They're coming," Nathaniel said, his voice tight with tension. "And there's more than one." We doused the fire and took up our positions. The night seemed to press in around us, the darkness almost palpable. For a long moment there was nothing but silence. Then they came. They burst from the tree line like living shadows, all teeth and claws and glowing eyes. I caught glimpses of twisted, half-human forms before the night erupted into chaos. Gunshots rang out, the flash of muzzles briefly illuminating the scene. I saw one of the creatures stumble as Egan's shot found its mark, but it kept coming. These things were tough, far tougher than any natural animal. I fired my own weapon, the silver bullets leaving trails of acrid smoke in their wake. One of the skinwalkers let out a shriek of pain as the blessed metal tore into its flesh. But for every one we wounded, it seemed like 2 more took its place. Nathaniel was a whirlwind of motion, his movements fluid and precise. He wielded an ancient-looking blade that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, and wherever it struck, the skinwalkers recoiled in agony. But we were outnumbered, and the skinwalkers were driven by a primal hunger and rage that seemed to give them superhuman strength. Slowly but surely, they began to push us back towards the house. Just when it seemed like we might be overwhelmed, Nathaniel shouted something in a language I didn't understand. He threw a handful of powder into the air, and suddenly the clearing was filled with a blinding light. The skinwalkers howled in pain and confusion, their sensitive eyes unable to cope with the sudden illumination. It was the opening we needed. We pressed our advantage, driving the creatures back. Silver bullets found their marks, blessed blades bit deep. One by one, the skinwalkers began to fall. The battle seemed to last for hours, though it was probably only minutes. By the time it was over, the ground was littered with the twisted bodies of the fallen skinwalkers. Those that could still move had retreated into the forest, leaving behind only the stench of blood and the echoes of their inhuman cries. We were battered, bleeding, but alive. As the adrenaline began to fade, I looked around at my companions. Egan was leaning heavily against a tree, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Nathaniel stood tall, his blade dripping with dark ichor, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of renewed threat. And me? I felt different, changed. The world I'd known, the reality I'd understood, had been shattered. But in its place, a new understanding was forming. These creatures, these skinwalkers, they were real, they were a threat, and we had fought them. As dawn began to break, casting long shadows across the blood-soaked clearing, Nathaniel turned to us. "It's not over," he said, his voice grave. "We've won a battle, but the war, it's just beginning." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words. I knew then that I couldn't go back to my old life. Not now, not after what I'd seen and done. This was my fight now, our fight. The skinwalkers were still out there, in the deep, dark places of the world, and as long as they threatened innocent lives, we would be there to stand against them. As we began to clean up and treat our wounds, I couldn't help but cast one last glance at the forest. For a moment I thought I saw a pair of glowing eyes watching us from the shadows, but then they were gone, leaving me to wonder if it had been real or just a trick of the light. One thing was certain. Our lives would never be the same again. The shadows of White Mountain had changed us forever, setting us on a path we could never have imagined. And somewhere out there in the darkness, the skinwalkers were waiting, biding their time until our next encounter. July 4th, 1999. A date forever etched in my memory. I'm Carter Reynolds, and this is my story. It's not an easy one to tell, but I feel compelled to share it, if only to warn others about what might be lurking in the shadows of our world. I had been living in my grandfather's old cabin, nestled deep in the Ozark mountain forests of Arkansas for about 6 months. After leaving the military, I craved solitude and a quiet place to readjust to civilian life. The cabin, with its rustic charm and isolation, seemed perfect. Most days were peaceful. I'd spend my time fishing in the nearby lake, hiking the surrounding trails, or working on repairs around the property. The routine was comforting, a stark contrast to the chaos and unpredictability of my time in service. Nights were my favorite. I'd sit out on the porch, a steaming mug of coffee in hand, watching for deer and other wildlife. My grandfather's old .30 rifle was always nearby. I rarely used it, but its presence was reassuring, a connection to the past and a safeguard against the unknown. The cabin itself was simple but sturdy. 2 rooms, a main living area with a small kitchen and a bedroom. The bathroom was an outhouse about 20 yards from the back door. Solar panels on the roof provided enough electricity for basic necessities and a well-supplied fresh water. It wasn't luxurious, but it was home. As July 4th approached, I noticed some activity at the old Peterson place down the mountain. A family had arrived for the holiday weekend. A brother and sister, both older than me, with 2 kids who seemed to have endless energy. I'd seen them around a few times, exchanging polite nods, but we generally kept to ourselves. That's how it was out here. Everyone respected each other's space. The night of the 4th started like any other. I was on my porch watching distant fireworks light up the sky. The Peterson family had a bonfire going, and I could hear faint laughter and the occasional pop of smaller fireworks. It was a perfect summer night, warm with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. Little did I know that this idyllic scene was about to shatter, plunging me into a nightmare that would haunt me for years to come. It was around 9:30 p.m. when I first heard it, a rustling in the woods to my right, too heavy to be a deer or coyote. My first thought was a bear. They weren't uncommon in the area, but they usually stayed closer to the lake, away from human activity. Concerned about the possibility of a bear wandering near the Peterson place with kids around, I decided to investigate. I grabbed my grandfather's rifle and stepped off the porch onto the dry grass. The night was clear, a full moon casting long shadows across the yard. As I approached the tree line, the rustling grew louder. Leaves crunched under heavy footsteps, branches snapped. Whatever it was big. I raised the rifle, my heart rate picking up. "Hey there," I called out, trying to sound calm. "Why don't you head on back to the woods?" That's when I saw it. A massive form emerged from behind a thick oak tree, and I felt my blood run cold. It wasn't a bear, it was far too tall, easily 7 or 8 feet high. Its body was hunched and covered in dark, coarse hair. But it was the creature's face that seared itself into my memory. Its head was elongated, almost wolf-like, with a protruding snout filled with sharp teeth. And the eyes, God, those eyes. They caught the moonlight and gleamed a deep, unnatural red. I'd never seen anything like it in all my years in these woods or during my time in the military. I froze, my finger hovering over the rifle's trigger. The creature tilted its head, studying me with an unsettling intelligence. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, in a blur of motion that belied its size, it vanished back into the tree line. I stood there, stunned, my heart pounding in my ears. What the hell had I just seen? My mind raced through possibilities. A bear with some kind of deformity, a mountain lion, even a person in some elaborate costume. But deep down I knew none of those explanations fit. The distant sound of laughter from the Peterson place snapped me back to reality. Whatever that thing was, it was heading in their direction. I had to warn them. I started down the path towards the Peterson property, my steps quickening as adrenaline coursed through my veins. The rifle felt heavy in my hands, and I found myself questioning whether I had actually seen what I thought I saw. Maybe the isolation was getting to me, playing tricks on my mind. Those doubts evaporated the moment I heard the first scream. It was high-pitched, clearly one of the children. Then a woman's voice shouting in panic, and beneath it all a deep, guttural roar that sent chills down my spine. It was the same creature I had seen. I was sure of it. I broke into a run, branches whipping at my face as I tore through the underbrush. The sounds of chaos grew louder. More screaming, the crash of something heavy moving through the woods, and that terrible, inhuman growling. As I burst into the clearing where the Peterson family had set up their campfire, the scene before me was like something out of a nightmare. The creature I had seen earlier was there, its massive form hunched over a small, writhing figure on the ground. With horror, I realized it was the young boy, no more than 8 or 9 years old. The child was screaming, desperately trying to crawl away from the monster's grasp. Long, wickedly curved claws swiped at his legs, leaving bloody gashes in their wake. A few yards away, the boy's parents were circling frantically, throwing rocks and shouting in a futile attempt to distract the beast. And then I saw her. The little girl, the boy's sister, lay motionless in the creature's other arm. Her head lolled to one side, her blonde hair matted with blood. I felt bile rise in my throat, but there was no time for shock or hesitation. I raised the rifle to my shoulder, aiming for the center of the creature's mass. The .30. 30 roared, the sound echoing through the woods. The beast bellowed in pain and anger, dropping the girl's body as it clutched at its now mangled arm. The boy seized his chance, scrambling away with a final terrified scream. His mother, who I now remembered was named Melissa, rushed to the fallen girl. The father, Tom, I recalled, was shouting something at me, waving his arms wildly towards the woods. "Get out of here, run!" But I couldn't leave them defenseless. I chambered another round, preparing to fire again. The creature, however, had other plans. Those hellish red eyes fixed on me, and with a speed that seemed impossible for its size, it charged. I fired again, but in the chaos and dim light, my shot went wide. In an instant it was upon me. I swung the rifle up, using it as a makeshift shield. The butt of the gun connected with a clawed hand reaching for my throat, deflecting it just enough. But I wasn't fast enough to avoid the other massive paw that raked across my chest and shoulder. Pain exploded through my body as I felt the creature's claws tear through flesh and muscle. The force of the blow sent me sprawling to the ground, my vision blurring from the shock and agony. I looked up to see the monster looming over me, its foul breath hot on my face. Drool dripped from its enormous, sharp-toothed maw. This was it, I thought. After surviving war zones and coming home to find peace, I was going to die here in the dirt, ripped apart by some ungodly beast in the Ozark backwoods. Just as the creature reared back for what I was sure would be the killing blow, another gunshot rang out. Not from my rifle, but a deeper, more powerful blast. The monster jerked back, howling in pain and rage. Through my haze of pain, I saw Tom. He stood a few yards away, his face a mask of terror and determination, wielding a shotgun. He fired again and again, each blast causing the creature to stagger and shriek. "Carter," Tom shouted, his voice barely audible over the monster's wails and the ringing in my ears. "Run, get help." Adrenaline surged through me, momentarily dampening the burning agony in my chest and shoulder. I scrambled to my feet, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through my body. But I knew I had to move, had to get away and find help. I ran like I'd never run before, crashing blindly through the dark woods. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me with every step, but I didn't slow down. Behind me I could still hear the creature's roars and Tom's shotgun blasts, but they grew fainter as I put distance between us. I had no idea if I was heading in the right direction, if I was going deeper into the wilderness or back towards civilization. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, had to find help before it was too late for the Peterson family. I don't know how long I ran. Time became meaningless, measured only in ragged breaths and the pounding of my heart. The pain in my chest was excruciating, each step sending fresh jolts of agony through my body. But the fear of what lay behind me was greater than any physical discomfort. Eventually, I stumbled upon the rough dirt road that led back to my cabin. A surge of relief washed over me, momentarily pushing aside the pain and exhaustion. I forced myself onward, knowing that my phone, my link to the outside world and potential help, was waiting in the cabin. As I approached the familiar clearing, I saw the outline of my cabin against the star-filled sky. It had never looked so welcoming. I staggered up the porch steps, fumbling with the door handle. My vision was starting to blur, black spots dancing at the edges. I practically fell through the doorway, my bloodied hand leaving a smear on the frame. I tried to call out to explain about the creature and the Peterson family, but the words caught in my raw, burning throat. The last thing I remember is collapsing against the wall, the world fading to darkness around me. I woke up in the county hospital, disoriented and in pain. The next few days passed in a haze of morphine, worried doctors, and confused questions. I drifted in and out of consciousness, plagued by nightmares of glowing red eyes and savage claws. When I was finally lucid enough to string together coherent thoughts, a county sheriff named Grady came to see me. He was a stocky man with a thick Ozark accent and eyes that had seen too much. He'd heard my delirious ramblings when I was brought in, and at first I think he wrote them off as the product of shock and blood loss. But something had changed his mind. Tom Peterson had survived the attack and made it back to his home. He corroborated my story, describing the creature in chilling detail that matched my own recollections. The reality of what we'd seen was too terrifying, too unbelievable, for either of us to have made it up. Grady told me they'd launched a search. He'd called in reinforcements, even alerted the National Guard. They went into those woods armed to the teeth, tracked for 2 solid days, but they found nothing. No fur, no blood, no tracks, nothing to justify the hunt or explain what had happened that night. The official story was that it had been a bear attack, possibly a large cat that had wandered out of its usual territory. The fireworks, they said, must have spooked it, causing it to lash out. It was easier to believe, I suppose, than the truth. But I knew what I had seen, and so did Tom. The little girl hadn't survived. Her name was Lily, and she was only 6 years old. Her brother, Michael, was physically recovering from his injuries, but the trauma of that night would likely stay with him forever. The Petersons left the area soon after, disappearing without a trace. I don't blame them. I couldn't stay either. As soon as I was well enough to leave the hospital, I sold the cabin. I couldn't bear the thought of going back there, of living with the memories and the fear of what might still be lurking in those woods. I moved to the city, surrounded myself with noise and people and light, anything to keep the darkness at bay. But the scars remained, both physical and mental. The long gashes across my chest and shoulder healed into thick ropey scars that ached when the weather changed. The nightmares came less frequently as the years passed, but they never truly went away. Some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, the phantom sensation of hot breath on my face, and the sound of inhuman growls echoing in my ears. In the years that followed, I became obsessed with finding an explanation for what had happened that night. I scoured local newspapers, online forums, and obscure cryptozoology websites, searching for any hint of similar encounters. I reached out to wildlife experts, folklorists, and even a few self-proclaimed monster hunters, hoping someone could shed light on what we had seen. Most dismissed my story outright. A few suggested it might have been a particularly large black bear with some kind of deformity or disease. Others proposed more outlandish theories, everything from escaped government experiments to interdimensional beings. None of it felt right. I tried to track down the Peterson family, hoping to compare notes with Tom or see how they were coping. But it was like they had vanished into thin air. No forwarding address, no social media presence, nothing. It was as if they were running from something, trying to erase all traces of their existence. My search led me down some dark paths. I found myself in seedy bars on the outskirts of small Ozark towns, listening to hushed stories of things that shouldn't exist. I hiked into remote areas, following vague leads and half-remembered sightings. More than once I found myself alone in the woods as night fell, my heart racing at every snapped twig or rustling leaf, but I never found any concrete evidence. No photographs, no DNA samples, nothing that could prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that what Tom and I had seen was real. The lack of proof was maddening, But in a way it was also a relief. Part of me didn't want to confirm that such a creature truly existed. As the years passed, my obsession gradually faded. I still kept an eye on the news from that region, still felt a chill when I heard about unexplained disappearances or strange animal sightings. But I learned to live with the uncertainty, to accept that some questions might never be answered. It's been 25 years since that night in the Ozarks. I'm older now, my hair graying at the temples, the scars on my chest faded to silver lines. I've built a life for myself, found some measure of peace, but I've never forgotten. Sometimes when the wind howls just right, or when I'm alone in the dark, I'm transported back to that moment. I can smell the pine needles and feel the humid summer air on my skin. I can hear the creatures growl, see those glowing red eyes in the shadows. I don't know if what we encountered that night was some unknown species, a freak of nature, or something beyond our understanding. I don't know if it's still out there, lurking in the deep woods, waiting for another unfortunate soul to cross its path. Part of me hopes it died from its wounds, that the nightmare ended that night. But another part of me knows better. The world is vast and full of mysteries. There are dark corners where ancient things still dwell, where the line between reality and nightmare blurs. Most people go through their lives never glimpsing what lies beyond the veil of the ordinary. And maybe that's for the best. But for those of us who have seen it, who have felt the touch of the unknown, the world is never quite the same. We walk with one foot in shadow, always aware that the impossible might be waiting just around the corner. So if you find yourself in the wilderness, whether it's the Ozark Mountains or any other remote place, remember this story. Be aware of your surroundings. Listen to your instincts. And if you hear something moving in the dark, something too big to be a deer or a bear, don't investigate. Don't try to be a hero. Don't try to be a hero. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because some things in this world aren't meant to be understood or confronted. I've often wondered why I survived that night when others didn't. Was it luck, fate, or was I spared for a reason? To be a witness, perhaps, to carry this story and its warning to others who might listen. Last year I received an unmarked envelope in the mail. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief handwritten note. Carter, it's still out there. Be careful. T. No return address, no further explanation, but I knew immediately who it was from. Tom Peterson reaching out after all these years. The message sent a chill down my spine, confirming my deepest fears. Whatever we encountered that night wasn't a one-time occurrence. It wasn't some freak accident or a creature that had since died or been captured. It was still out there. I debated long and hard about what to do with this information. Should I alert the authorities, try to mount another search, or simply keep the knowledge to myself, buried deep like so many other secrets? In the end, I decided to share my story, not with the police or the media, but with you, whoever you are reading these words. Because knowledge is power, and in this case, it might just save your life. I don't expect you to believe everything I've written here. Hell, there are days I have trouble believing it myself. But I ask you to keep an open mind, to remember that the world is bigger and stranger than we often allow ourselves to imagine. And if you ever find yourself in the wilderness, whether it's the Ozarks or anywhere else, and you hear something moving in the shadows, something that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up and your heart race, don't dismiss it. Don't try to rationalize it away. Trust your instincts. They might just save your life. As for me, I've made my peace with what happened. I can't change the past, can't bring back those we lost that terrible night. But I can honor their memory by sharing this story, by keeping the truth alive. I still dream about it sometimes, about red eyes gleaming in the darkness, about claws and teeth and terror. But I've learned to live with those dreams, to use them as a reminder of the thin line between the world we think we know and the shadows that lie beyond. So I'll keep watching, keep listening, and if I ever hear of another sighting, another encounter with something that shouldn't exist, I'll be ready. Not to fight it, I learned that lesson the hard way, but to warn others, to keep the memory alive. Because out there in the deep woods and dark hollows, something is waiting, something ancient and terrible and hungry. And it's patient, oh so patient, so be careful out there, watch the shadows, listen to the silence. And remember, not all monsters are mere legends. Some of them are all too real.